What happened over the last 24 hours was not just another exchange in an already expanding war. It was the moment this conflict stopped looking like a direct U.S. Iran confrontation and started looking like a regional chain reaction, with Iranian drones striking Azerbaijan, Gulf energy infrastructure coming under pressure, and answering with a bombing wave over Tehran so large it appeared to turn night into day. That is why this story matters immediately. The biggest headline is not only that Iranian projectiles landed near Nakhchivan International Airport, injuring 2 people and forcing Azerbaijan to shut its southern airspace for 12 hours, but that the strike may have opened an entirely new front on Iran's northern edge. Once that happens, the war stops being about one battlefield and starts becoming a question of how many borders can still hold before the map begins to move. And that was only the opening layer. While Azerbaijan was absorbing the shock, Iran was also keeping pressure on Gulf energy flows, with oil surging sharply as shipping and infrastructure fears spread across the region. That is what makes this moment so dangerous, because the conflict is no longer widening in just one direction. It is now pushing into airspace, energy routes, allied territory, and regional politics all at once. The warning from Baku gives the whole picture its real weight. President Ilham Aliyev made clear that Azerbaijan will not leave such actions unanswered. That is the real danger now. The war may still be centered on Iran, but the pressure wave is moving outward fast enough to pull new states into the fight. So the real point of this story is not simply that the United States is striking Iran hard. It is that Washington now appears to be doing 2 things at the same time: collapsing Iran's ability to keep the war going from the air, while allowing the economic shock from Hormuz to spread outward fast enough that the pressure is no longer only military. That is what turns this from a violent exchange into a strategic squeeze. The military side of that squeeze is becoming clearer by the day. Reuters reported that U.S. strikes are now moving progressively deeper into Iranian territory, while the White House has said Washington is moving to dismantle Iran's missile production, which tells you the campaign is no longer centered only on retaliation or symbolic punishment. It is aimed at the systems that let Iran launch, reload, regroup, and keep firing after the first blow. And the economic side is rising almost in parallel. Brent crude surged toward $119 a barrel this week, after having been near $81 only days earlier, while Gulf energy officials warned that if the war kept choking maritime flows, the pressure could become far more severe. That is why this cannot be reduced to airstrikes plus oil panic, because in reality both tracks are feeding each other. The deeper the strikes go inland, the harder Iran leans on disruption, and the harder disruption bites, the more outside powers get dragged into the crisis. One quote captures the military logic of this phase almost perfectly. As General Dan Kane put it, "We will now begin to expand inland, striking progressively deeper into Iranian territory and creating additional freedom of maneuver for U.S. forces." That line is the thesis of the whole campaign in one sentence, because it makes clear that the objective is no longer only to hit Iran, but to open space for even more pressure afterward. So, this is the framework we need to keep in mind going forward. The war is not just escalating in intensity, it is becoming more systematic, with every strike on an airbase, missile site, or production node tying directly into a larger contest over shipping, energy, and endurance. Once a conflict starts operating on both the military map and the economic map at the same time, it becomes much harder to contain. The first capability now being hit hard is Iran's ability to keep its air war alive from the west of the country. That matters because once an airbase stops functioning, the problem is not only that aircraft may be stuck on the ground, but that the entire rhythm of sorties, dispersal, refueling, and rapid response starts to break down. In your core story, that is exactly what the strikes around Hamadan are meant to show. The key point is that this was not just a strike on buildings. The runway, taxiways, and operating surfaces were hit in a way designed to make the base itself unusable, which means even surviving aircraft become far less relevant if they cannot safely take off, land, or reposition when needed. That is the military logic here. You do not always need to destroy every jet if you can destroy the conditions that allow those jets to fly. And the pressure did not stop at Hamadan. The wider belt of western Iran is also shown taking repeated hits, with IRGC-linked sites around Pave and Ilam coming under attack, which reinforces the same pattern again and again. This is not random bombing. It looks much more like a deliberate effort to strip away the Western military network that helps Iran coordinate air activity, protect launch systems, and support operations closer to Iraq and the Gulf. That is why one line from General Dan Kane fits this part of the story so well. He said, "We will now begin to expand inland, striking progressively deeper into Iranian territory and creating additional freedom of maneuver for U.S. forces." That is exactly what these attacks suggest in practice, because once Western Iranian air infrastructure starts going dark, the space available to American and Allied air power begins to widen. So the first layer of this campaign is becoming clear. Before you even get to missile production, drones, or Tehran, the United States appears to be trying to make Western Iran less usable as a military platform, and that is a major problem for Tehran, because wars become much harder to sustain once key bases stop functioning as bases at all. What makes this phase more dangerous is not just the fact that strikes are landing, but the scale and pace at which they now seem to be landing. In your core story, Western Iran is not being hit once and left behind, it is being hit in layers, with air bases, IRGC facilities, missile launchers, and support sites all taking pressure in close sequence. That changes the meaning of the campaign. Because once attacks begin stacking this quickly, the problem for Tehran is no longer one damaged location at a time, but the loss of operational tempo across multiple fronts. The maritime side of the story shows the same pattern. The Iranian Navy around Hormuz is having already taken devastating losses, with reported warship losses reaching around 30, while commercial movement through the strait has effectively frozen, and oil prices have surged from roughly $81 to above $90 in about a day. Whether every number settles exactly there or not, the broader point is clear. Military pressure and market pressure are now moving upward together, and that is exactly what makes this crisis so unstable. That is why the warning from the Gulf matters so much. Qatar's energy minister Saad Al-Kaabi said, "Everybody's energy price is going to go higher." That line fits this section perfectly, because it shows that the scale of the campaign is no longer being measured only in bombs dropped or targets hit, but in how fast the effects are rippling outward into oil flows, storage limits, and global pricing. So this is the second layer of the story. The war is accelerating quickly enough that Iran is not just being damaged, it is being forced to absorb simultaneous pressure on its military network and the economic space around it, and conflicts become much harder to control once both clocks start ticking at the same time. The third problem for Iran is that these strikes are no longer just heavy, they are reaching deep enough to make distance feel meaningless. In this story, the pressure is no longer sitting only on border regions or scattered military outposts, because it is now landing on missile production, weapons facilities, and key sites in and around Tehran. Once that starts happening over and over, the message becomes brutally simple. Some of the places Iran would normally treat as protected depth are no longer safe depth at all. That is why the destruction of sites like Parchin matters so much in the flow of this war. A hit like that is not only about today's damage, because it also speaks to tomorrow's capacity, tomorrow's output, and tomorrow's ability to keep feeding missiles, weapons, and support systems back into the fight. In other words, this is no longer only a campaign to break what Iran is using now, but to shrink what Iran can still build next. And the same logic applies to the repeated strikes around the capital. When smoke is rising again and again over Tehran, when weapons-related facilities on the outskirts are being hit, and when military-linked infrastructure is being treated like an active target set, the capital stops looking like a secure rear area and starts looking like another pressured battle space. That is why Nadav Shoshani's line fits this moment so well. They are a legal, military target. So this is the third layer of the story. Iran is not just being hit hard, and it is not just being hit often. It is being hit far enough inside the country that the old idea of safety through depth is starting to collapse. Once that happens, every remaining launcher, factory, and protected site has to operate with a much smaller margin for error than before. Another problem is now becoming impossible to ignore. Even while Iran is losing ships, sites, and positions, it is still forcing the U.S. and its partners into an ugly cost trap. Cheap drones costing around $30,000 are still drawing responses from systems that can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions, which means the battlefield is no longer only about who has more firepower. It is also about who can afford to keep shooting. That is why the move for low-cost defenses matters so much in this story. Washington is now scrambling to bring in cheaper interceptor solutions, and Ukraine's experience against Shahed drones has suddenly become valuable far beyond Europe. As Volodymyr Zelensky put it, partners are turning to us, to Ukraine, asking for help in defending against Shahed drones, with expertise and real operational experience. So this is not just a side issue. It shows that Iran may be under huge pressure, but it still has one tool that can distort the whole war by forcing richer militaries to spend far more than they want just to keep the sky clear. That is the kind of imbalance that can drag a conflict out far longer than the first wave of strikes might suggest. The fifth problem for Iran is that its biggest weakness is now being exposed in the open. It does not need to lose everything to lose enough. In your core story, warships are being destroyed, launchers are being picked off, missile production is taking damage, and even air defenses are being worn down, which means the issue is no longer whether Iran still has assets left. The issue is whether it can replace losses fast enough to keep the whole system functioning under this level of pressure. That is what makes this so dangerous for Tehran. A country can absorb one strike, and sometimes even 10. But once losses start hitting ships, factories, launchers, logistics, and command structure at the same time, every replacement effort becomes slower, more expensive, and less effective. That is why Marco Rubio's warning fits the broader logic here. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. So this is the deeper weakness now coming into view. Iran is not only under attack, it is being pushed into a type of war where every answer it chooses becomes costly, and where every day of continued fighting risks draining systems that are much harder to rebuild than they are to damage. And this is where the conflict stops being only about Iran and the United States. In your core story, oil storage pressure is building in the Gulf. Azerbaijan is moving forces toward the northern border. China is being discussed as a possible indirect supporter, and Russia is accused of feeding intelligence that may help Iran target U.S. positions. Once all of those threads begin moving at the same time, the war stops looking contained and starts looking like a regional crisis, with outside powers already leaning into it. That is why even smaller developments matter more than they seem. A missile landing near Prince Sultan Air Base, an Iranian ship docking in Kochi, or reports of new troop movement near Iran's borders are not isolated side stories anymore, because each one shows another part of the map being pulled into the same conflict. That is exactly why Mark Rutte's line still fits the wider picture. Our allies are not directly involved in this conflict, but they have to protect their territories, and that's exactly what they are doing. So this is the sixth layer of the war. The battlefield may still sit inside and around Iran, but the consequences are already spreading through oil routes, allied bases, neighboring borders, and great power competition, and that is usually the point where a war becomes much harder to slow down than to start. So this is what Iran is now being forced to face. It is losing room at sea, losing freedom in the air, losing safety in depth, and losing the certainty that its old model of endurance can still hold under this kind of pressure. That is why this war no longer looks like a contained exchange, but like a widening test of whether Tehran can survive military attrition, economic shock, and strategic isolation at the same time. The danger is not just that Iran is taking losses, but that those losses are now stacking across too many layers at once, and wars become much harder to manage once naval damage, missile pressure, oil disruption, and regional escalation all start feeding each other. But this still may not be the most dangerous phase yet, because if the next round of strikes keeps pushing deeper, And if Hormuz remains under pressure while more outside actors edge closer to the fight, then the next move will not just raise the cost of this war, it could redraw the entire shape of it.